Hey everyone. I'm gonna put the meeting notes link in the chat. Feel free to drop your name in the attendance list, and then we get an idea of who's on the call. So we got a couple of things on the agenda today. The first one is from Michael Lieberman, an update on Fresca. And then the second is a presentation from Adolfo on VEX and SBOMs, which should be interesting for discussion. Reminder that these meetings are recorded and should be uploaded to YouTube. They were happening, someone was doing it for me, and then I think that stopped. So I need to go back and look for this meeting, which ones haven't been uploaded to the YouTube channel, and try to make sure those get uploaded. I think there was a comment around that I saw, but feel free to ping me in Slack too and remind me. I could use a nudge.
It doesn't look like this one's being recorded currently, and it looks like we need to ask the host to record it.
It's recording.
Oh, okay. Didn't see it on my side.
Yeah, it's well on my side. I've got the beeping red thing in the upper left.
Fantastic. Great.
Okay.
I'll help close the loop then separately.
Oh, okay, thanks, Brian. Yeah, someone was uploading them and it had like a nice little OpenSSF slide in the beginning, and I'm not a YouTube expert, so I had no idea how to do that when I was uploading salsa recording. So anyway, cool. So before we get started, anyone new to the meeting today that wants to say a quick hello or introduce yourself?
I'll say hi. So I'm Sebastian Awad. I'm new to this meeting. I previously worked on the update framework and Uptane and some variations of that, and I work on package manager security at Anaconda.
Oh, awesome. Welcome.
I'll say hi too. Hey, my name is Chapman Pindry. I work at Bloomberg. I do foundational supply chain security work there. And I'm a pretty big open source contributor to the Encore products, so Sift and Gripe.
Cool.
Hey, I'm Melba. I work for IBM doing supply chain security for our products. And I'm part of the Salsa working group, I guess, or subgroup. And so I noticed a lot of the Salsa folks join this call, so decided to attend.
Awesome. And Sanket,
Sanket here. Yeah, I am actually working with Mehdi, and I know he's been part of these calls before, Mehdi Entezari, and part of the Unisys group that works a lot on the DBOM and the software supply security chain. So happy to be here.
Awesome, welcome. Yeah, for the new folks, this meeting's been great to get presentations. That's how we started the meeting early on when we weren't quite sure what all the problems were in supply chain space. So if there's a topic that's relevant to open source software supply chain stuff, feel free to toss your name in the upcoming meeting slot, and we'll get you scheduled. Anybody else want to say hi? All right, let's get into it then. So Mike, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, just a couple of quick updates on Fresca, just for those who aren't super familiar. Just as a reminder, it's one of the projects underneath this working group. And so it's been progressing pretty nicely over the past couple of months. A lot of new features tying together stuff like some sort of other open source tools that are underneath the Linux Foundation, like Tecton and Tecton Chains and Keyverno and a bunch of these tools, as well as sort of implementing some of the Salsa best practices. We're trying to kind of hit Salsa 3 by default. We're pretty close. We just need to wait for some Spiffy Spire updates to Tecton and Tecton chains to land, which we have a couple of PRs open for that. Actually, Brendan Lum is one of the contributors on that one, along with Parth Patel. But so we're doing a bunch of stuff there. Just wanted to kind of highlight, we're still looking for additional contributors if folks are interested and that sort of thing. In particular, the two big threads that we've been working on recently that we're interested in getting some increased community collaboration on is, one is around runtime visibility. So for those who are not super familiar with the secure software factory coming out of the CNCF, let me see if I can just get this. I will just post this here in chat. This was sort of a white paper coming out of the CNCF that is an architecture around secure build with a focus on supply chain. And so there's like three key pillars there. One being sort of a secure framework by which we can describe how we run builds and pipelines. The second is sort of building, the provisioning of the actual builds themselves tied to identity, so zero trust for your actual build. So that's both of those are sort of somewhat accomplished in Fresca via Tecton and Spire in those cases. And then the final piece that we've been working on is runtime visibility, which is just how can you sort of guarantee that once that a job while it's running is not being currently interfered with either by an upstream dependency that's trying to reach out to the malware.com or whatever and do something nefarious, or that somebody who has access to the control plane is not trying to sort of get in there and attack a pod directly. So that's one big thing that we've been looking at, and sort of looking at lots of different tools, whether it's a lot of different open source tools on that front, looking at eBPF and so on. But we're definitely interested in getting some more thoughts on that. And in addition to that, we are also working with a couple of different groups regarding confidential computing and sort of hardware keys. So one of the big things, given that we're doing a lot of stuff with SigStore in Fresca, we are currently looking at ways to actually back the root of trust in hardware, so that we can, for two main reasons. One is ensuring that if a job does steal some sort of secret, it's not really usable without the actual hardware that backed it. And then secondarily, we're also looking at different ways to, with the hardware-backed identities, being able to actually sort of associate that with the build, so that we can actually have that sort of, where we can sort of guarantee that builds were actually happening on hardware that was approved for use, as opposed to somebody who had nefariously gotten hardware attached to your build cluster in some way. So that's one big piece of it. And then the second big piece is we are also looking at confidential computing for things like, could you run builds in trusted execution environments, secure enclaves, and those sorts of things in cases of where you don't necessarily where you really want to make sure that stuff is not interfering with the build, as well as in cases where the source code itself is considered secret or is considered like really sensitive, or some sort of data that you're pulling into the build is considered sensitive, and you don't want to give access to the host to actually be able to see what's going on. So those are the main updates for Fresca. And inside the Google Doc for the notes for this thing, I have some additional stuff in there if folks want to contribute or join. There is a OpenSSF. It's under the OpenSSF calendar. Is the meeting, and it's every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. So it didn't happen this week. It'll be happening next week.
Cool. Do you guys have a separate Slack channel too, or are you using?
Oh, yes. So we are in the OpenSSF Slack under the FRSCA channel. So, oops, I spelled it wrong.
Do you have a logo yet?
Not yet. I know that a few folks were out because we were going to be asking for some help on that front. So hopefully soon.
Okay. Any other questions for Mike? No. All right, cool. Accidentally muted myself. The next thing we have on the agenda is a presentation from Adolfo. And I'm not sure how much time he's going to take, but we might end up early if anyone has any other topics they want to toss in the agenda for discussion. Please speak up now or say something in the chat and we can time box Adolfo a bit if needed. Quiet group this morning or today. All right. Adolfo, are you ready? Do you want to screen share? All right, take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So let me see if screen sharing works. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, so if for anybody who's around the SBOM and SBOM tooling, SBOM specs world, probably knows that during this in the past week, CISA has been running this series of listening sessions, which have brought together people from lots of industries, government contractors, tool makers, and some of the learnings from those sessions have been really great. And one of the recurrent subjects that have been coming up is VEX. VEX is the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, which is a way to let your users know whether or not you're affected by a certain vulnerability. So I thought it was important that to start discussing some of the aspects of VEX outside of the usual VEX circles and their calls, just to try to get the conversation rolling about how people are using it, how they see it, and so on. So for people who are already familiar with VEX, this is going to be like an introductory talk just to set the groundwork, and maybe we can build from there. Because my idea at the end is to pose some open questions so that folks maybe can start, if not sharing, maybe thinking about how VEX fits into your supply chain setup. So okay, so let's start. So the first thing is what problem is VEX trying to solve? So as I said, if you have a known vulnerable component inside of your software, what does it mean to be affected? You know it's in there. So is there a chance that that idea may be a little bit nuanced? So for example, if I give you the phrase, there is a spider in my house, you can think about that idea and it can have several possible meanings. So for example, maybe Puerco has a pet spider in his house. Maybe I just found a spider somewhere dead lying around, or maybe there is an actual spider in my house and I am about to ingest it while I sleep. You don't know. So if you think about this idea and you apply it to, there is a component with a known security vulnerability in my product, can this idea have different meanings? At least from the user's perspective, it may have several meanings. So until today, we've come to become really good at expressing the components inside of software products using SBOMs. So the idea of an SBOM, you have a product, you have several components in it, and then you take those components, list them in documents, and those documents are the actual bill of materials of your describing your project, then an approach is you take those bill of materials, feed them into security scanners, and then they give you information. But sometimes that information can take this shape. For example, maybe matching a list of vulnerabilities with known versions of those components. There are other aspects of course, of scanning, but SBOMs will give you this overview. So Vex is trying to solve this for your is trying to break this idea and give you more information about those components living inside of your software product. So let's think about what it means to have that vulnerable component. So what is exactly what you can tell users using Vex? So Vex is centered around products, not versions, not specific packages, but products. And the idea in a Vex document is that you can you define a set of products, and then you pair those with a vulnerability, and those will give you a set of outcomes. And those outcomes can be, yes, my product is affected by that vulnerable component, and it gives you the chance to give guidance to your users as to what to do next. Then it may not be affected, and it gives you the chance to express why it is not affected, and it also gives you the chance to tell users you just don't know yet what's going on. So then another two key factors about Vex is, one, information is time-based and it's relevant for a certain period of time. So that's the first one. And the second is Vex documents are supposed to be machine readable. Okay, so going back to the idea of conveying that information to your customers, the first thing that you would tell after knowing you have a component listed as vulnerable is you need to give your customers an assessment of impact. So as we saw before, Vex defines your project may be affected, not affected, it may be fixed, meaning it was affected at some point, but it fixes already inside the product, or it's still on investigation. If your project turns out to be affected by a known vulnerability, Vex will give you the chance to give, if it's not affected, Vex will give you the chance to express to your users why it is not affected. So it provides a set of justifications to that you can express in the documents, along with a human readable explanation of why it is not affected. This include the component may not be present. For example, if a scanner picks up a vulnerable component in a container layer and you override that later, the squash file system may not have that component. Then code may not be there. So for example, if you have a vulnerable package and you patch it, it may be that a scanner picks up the version listed as affected, but you already patched it. So the code is not there. The code may not be in the executable path. So citing Dr. Alan Friedman's example, I think there are two, if I remember correctly, I think it's two functions that will actually trigger the heartbleed bug inside of OpenSSL, and these are among hundreds of other functions inside of the library. So if you don't trigger those, you could express that the vulnerability is not in your executable path. Then the code that is exploitable cannot be controlled by an adversary. So that the simplest example of that one is, you know that if you connect to a socket, feed it some garbage, you may be able to get an exploit, but maybe your product doesn't even expose that socket. And the same thing for mitigation. So if you know that feeding input to some component will give you elevated access, maybe you have a code in front of that to sanitize the input. Because in the end, this Vex is describing a product, and it's not describing a library. So it's a product as a whole. So what are the ways that we currently can express VEX metadata to our users? So there are currently two ways, at least that I know of. The first one is in CSAF documents and also inside of CycloneDX. So let's take a quick look at how the VEX metadata looks inside of the documents. The first one is in CycloneDX. So while we go through these examples, keep in mind the formula that I showed earlier, which is product, vulnerability, and a set of outcomes. So in CycloneDX, you would have your product listed as the application inside of the document. CycloneDX, for those that may be not familiar, is mostly known for being a good way of writing software bill of materials. It also has some other tricks of its sleeve, like, for example, conveying vulnerability information. So here's the application listed as a component. Then here's the information about the vulnerability. This is a made up data, of course. And then here's the assessment of impact, which says that my enterprise professional application version 2000 is not affected. And finally, the analysis conveying information of why it is not affected. This is the machine readable label, which is vulnerable code cannot be controlled by adversary, and then a human readable explanation. The next one is in CSAF documents. So CSAF, which is Common Security Advisory Framework, also defines a way of conveying security information about products. And so here are the same elements inside of the document. Here's the product. So CSAF documents really allow for great expression in defining products and product sets. It allows you to define product families, groups, so list them in all sorts of creative ways. Then here's the link to the vulnerability, then the product status. So I'm stating here that version 1 is affected, but version 2 is no longer affected. Then flags inside of the document that tell me why my product may not be available, may not be vulnerable. So here I'm saying Enterprise 2000 version 2 is no longer vulnerable because the components are not longer present inside of the product. So these are simplified documents, of course, just to give you an idea of what they look like. CSAF has one feature which may be relevant to the use of VEX and expressing VEX information, and it has all of this metadata about tracking the evolution of the document on how it evolves on versions, and maybe CycloneDX has it too. I don't remember. But this tracking information allows you to know if you're looking at on how the document has been changing over time. So that's basically the presentation. Before leaving, I would like to post some open questions about which at least I have been thinking about, and I would certainly love to hear what people have been thinking about VEX. So, for example, things like how can we discover VEX metadata and how do we store the documents? Both CycloneDX and CSAF provide guidance on how to store and locate the documents, but sometimes these recommendations turn out to be not as useful in practice. So, for example, are we thinking about storing them in other sorts of attestations that we're already doing? Maybe pointing to them in transparency logs, all of that sort of questions are valid here. For example, one of the big questions regarding VEX and some of the uses of SBOMs is, what about when we compose SBOMs dynamically, or we have a workload defined with several SBOMs? This is, I think, the most puzzling question for me right now, since if you think about a cloud native environment, you may have several workloads running, which if you compose the SBOMs for them, all of them may be different. So you have a running workload. If you update a base image, it effectively has a new SBOM. So if we describe exploitability information in a VEX document, which is paired to a product, how does it apply to changing images, for example, and changing workloads? That is, while I understand that VEX may be fixed in time and maybe dependent on the information available at the time, how do we express, how do we match information about the product to its running workload, for example? Questions about trust. Who can produce VEX documents? Is it valid if a company doesn't provide VEX information, but I have an assessment? Can I produce that for a product? Can I trust whoever is providing that information? And another thing is, should we have a expiration time on VEX documents, for example? I mean, those get superseded by new versions, but do we need the freshness of the data? And finally, what I would be most interested in hearing is how people are using VEX. Are you using it? Yes. How? Are you writing documents, consuming them? And if no, why do you think it applies to your scenario or not? Or are you planning to do it? So my Twitter handle, it's Puerco, if you want to connect and still discuss a little bit more about VEX. I'm happy to hear use cases and ideas about people, and yeah, that's it.
Melba, you have your hand up.
Oh, yeah. So quick question, since I've not been participating in the VEX meetings. One of the concerns is overwhelming customers with constantly changing VEX files. Internally makes perfect sense, right? To use, it would be in an automated fashion, and you would give the teams time to remediate before publishing the notification that we are affected. But if you're constantly changing these files, because sometimes it's daily or multiple times a day, there's a new vulnerability. Is the team giving any thought to that? And maybe publishing VEX publicly constantly isn't really the right approach?
So one thing is, I'm coming towards VEX mostly as an end user and implementer. So I have some ideas that may not reflect the current VEX group thinking, and it's basically, well, my opinion is that all of this information should be machine handled, and tooling is going to be the answer at some point, but I would love to hear what the others think.
I think there was some discussion that might affect that answer in the chat about VEX as a separable format. It doesn't have to be in the SBOM for exactly that reason. Its data and lifecycle are different. So that's designed into the standard.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think also one of the, at least the initial use cases really is around kind of like the delivery system of like where these documents come from. And I think initially it's looking at it from a product standpoint. And obviously I think the group also has brought up, the VEX working group has brought up things like, oh, you know, like the disclosure policy and things like that as well. So at least from the current point of view, it seems like the discussion is more focused on the product side, but then, you know, with SBOM as well, we will need like kind of the trickle down information as well. It's libraries and the repos.
Yeah, I put it in the chat that, you know, for us, we have several contracts right, with large corporations or government entities that you are not allowed to disclose a vulnerability until you have a fix or a patch, right? So having the ability for customers to pull VEX, right, or receive the VEX prematurely is not, we're not capable of doing that, right? We might be able to expose, the one VEX file that is allowed because we have the fixes, but I think that's a big concern, right? Internally, perfect use case, but externally, we have some legal challenges with posting information like that until we have fixed all the vulnerabilities or at least have a patch.
You would be able to post it to the customer directly though, right? Just between you two?
No, there are some
Okay.
contracts where it literally says you are not allowed to disclose unless we are disclosed first, right? And there's a lot of contracts like that. And the idea is that if you disclose it to a customer and they have somebody that, is, nefarious and wants to do damage to other companies that they know use that product, then they can go attack that product because they have premature information about that vulnerability that's not fixed. So we try very hard not to disclose that until it's fixed so that we don't put our customers at risk.
So let me ask a question. If the SBOM is provided for a product, then technically the customer of that product can know or find out what are the vulnerabilities for that product without looking at the VEX report.
Yes
Or
and no.
potential, I should say potential vulnerabilities. I shouldn't say vulnerabilities.
Yes, correct. Yes and no. Just like the presentation stated, right? There are scenarios where something isn't affected because of X, Y, Z, right? And so the customer can't state certainty or 100% certain that it is affected. They would, ask our PCERT team to validate, and we would go investigate, right? But that wouldn't be a true case, right? Unless the SBOM or unless the vulnerability has been disclosed by IBM and has said they are affected or not affected or it's been fixed, a customer can't state that we are vulnerable because we haven't made an official documentation on that vulnerability.
Now, let me ask a question. If that information, the VEX report, or even in some cases SBOMs, are provided privately to the customers of the product, would that help? Sorry, Michael, I didn't see your hand.
I missed the question. Is it providing the VEX or the S?
No, VEX, like the VEX report, if you make it private, such that only the customers of it can see, customers of the product can see that corresponding VEX report, would that help with your liability or legal issue?
Yeah, I think it depends, right? I think there would have to be some very special NDAs in place. Unfortunately, I wish I could say a yes to everything, but our legal team has a lot of red tape on what we can or can't do. And so that's a lot of the discussion that we've been having internally on, well, what can or can't we publish? When can we or can't we publish something? Can we use NDAs, right? Or can we use some sort of timestamp watermarking, right? To make sure that we know where the source came from if something gets leaked prematurely. We don't have all the answers, but unfortunately, it's not a simple question for us to answer.
Thanks.
So there's a couple of things. First, I think to tie to this topic, I think there's some interesting challenges there. But I'm curious, actually, like, if there is a known vulnerability, because the way I've been seeing VEX being talked about and whatnot was like, hey, you have there's a CVE that's out regarding, I don't know, log4j, and this tool, has the right configuration for log4j, so it wouldn't be exposed, and that's kind of the VEX that's coming out. So I'd be curious to know, like, what sorts of situations there could be where, like, a vulnerability itself is not known, but you would still at some point, I guess, distribute a vex for it. I'm not. That's not particularly clear to me.
Yeah, I think that's the time fashion of the document. So they're bound to a certain point in time. So you expect them to you expect to be new versions of the document once the information about the vulnerable packages changes, and also information about how those packages affect your product. So that's why I was posing the question at the end: should these documents expire? Because that would guarantee you some freshness.
Yeah, so that was going to be my follow-up was I think it'd be interesting because I can imagine some universes where some situations where there could be contradictory information, right? A provider of a package might say, "Hey, we're not vulnerable to this," and some security firm says, "Actually, we tested your package and it is very much, in fact, vulnerable to this." And what does that look like?
Yeah, so that's the other thing I thought too. That's why in the end I added the question. So who could be a good source of truth for the VEX information? Just the company? Can others also emit some of that?
I would suggest that if the only person who should be able to do a VEX summary for an individual product would be the owner of the product. Otherwise, you could get into difficult situations where somebody else would start issuing VEXs to potentially discredit other products. I mean, this does assume that generally speaking, people want to do the right thing by their product, as opposed to trying to hide the information. But I think there was an issue around Log4j. A company, I won't name them, issued a CVE for Log4j, and they were not the Apache open source project, and that caused quite a bit of unhappiness within the Apache Software Foundation. And I think there's a general principle that I think should hold true, which is that should be the responsibility of the responsible party, which is the owner.
So so there are cases by which, what they call data enhancers can actually take the SBOMs and identify the potential vulnerabilities. So I don't think once the SBOM is all about transparency, correct? And once the SBOMs are out, it doesn't prevent anybody else to do analysis of the data in the application and find out what its potential vulnerabilities are.
Brendan, you have your hand up.
Yeah. I think just want to chime in a little bit on a bit of the conversation. So I think one of the things around this, like what we trust, I think it's pretty much the same question as the SBOM question. Given SBOMs today have various levels of accuracy, there's a question of, can I trust this thing for my provider? And some companies have been doing that for years with vulnerabilities, where they do reverse engineering and trying to figure out what's actually affected. So I think the VEX question on like who we can trust and how we can trust it will be similar to SBOM. And I think with SBOM, we've seen that it's still ways until we get the high fidelity information for accuracy. So the additional data sources from vendors can also benefit because, especially with a lot of the source of data, they can help generate better SBOMs. So I think, I think the story still has to be done. Probably have to do some level of attestations and a trust policy around that. Michael, I think you brought up an earlier point. I think it's interesting. So VEX, you can also say that if you don't know whether you're affected by a certain CVE, I think the default is like there's a under investigation. So you can state that, you know, there's a CVE, we don't know whether we're affected, so we just flag it as under investigation.
Yeah, and I think this is something that I know Brendan and I have been working on around just sort of generally this problem. One of the and sometimes I get confused by this. It's the you should not take the lack of something like a vex, meaning that there is or isn't a vulnerability. It just means that you do not have the information, right? Or rather, the thing that I'm actually kind of curious about with some of this stuff is, right, when I go and view, like, is the lack of a vex mean that it actually is vulnerable? That can kind of get complicated, right? Like, at what point can a, is there something, and I don't know if this is included in any of the other stuff that is there something like the opposite of a vex, of a package acknowledging that it is vulnerable to something and that currently there is no patch for it, or this particular version is vulnerable and yes, you should be updating to the more recent version? Because you know, if it's just something like, if based on what we've been discussing here, if certain companies are reluctant to issue a vex without disclosing other things and whatever else, I could see a lot of situations where people would be reluctant to either acknowledge that there is a vulnerability or issue a vex given certain situations. And I think the thing that we're trying to push here is more transparency, not have folks scared of giving transparency.
I wish Josh was here, because I think I really like the GSD has this idea of namespaces, so different vendors can kind of like say, this is my evaluation of it, and I'm putting the information, this more for like vulnerability information, but I think it would map well as well with facts.
Yeah, and I think, like, because when I think about purely from the end user perspective, an end user is going to go and download a package or download, and when I say a package, I don't just purely mean the code. It could be a combination of the source code plus the configuration plus infrastructure as code, whatever. It doesn't necessarily really matter. But when I think about that, I think that there's probably, you know, the things I would want to know is, whoever is giving me this thing, to the best of their knowledge, are they exposed to certain CVEs? And I want to have information that I could use to make informed decisions. So if they are vulnerable to a certain thing, if you use it a certain way, I want to know. If they're not vulnerable to a certain thing because they have mitigating whatever, you know, something like Vex or whatever, and they can say, hey, I still want to know. And if they are not sure, right, I want to know. And I think all three of those are super valuable to sort of the end user who just is like, hey, I'm not building software, I'm just consuming it.
Can you picture a scenario where conveying information as what Vex conveys will be expected? Probably, right? Once information of SBOMs starts flowing through their systems, you're gonna start demanding that, or not. I think it is. But...
Yeah, no, I agree. I think folks are going to start demanding this information, and I think over time, and I know this is a big thing that's being discussed at especially large enterprises that are more like consumers of this sort of stuff, like for example, large banks and whatnot. They're coming out there and saying, hey, at a certain point, you know, we might be signing big contracts that have that as an expectation, right? You know, that you are going to be, you know, giving SBOM, you're going to be giving Vex information as part of the deal. And if, you know, and I think once again, to Melba's point, I think we might start to see a bit of a shift where customers might start asking for some of this stuff. And there might be a little bit of also a shift in sort of the legal way of thinking around some of it, just given some of the stuff that had come out last year with the executive order and some of the laws and regulations coming down that are sort of making this more of an expectation.
Yeah, to circling back to Melba's point, I think one thing that it's going to ease the flow of VEX information is that VEX is supposed to be mostly for conveying not affected information. So once there's a security disclosure, the first thing, there are two main goals that your product will need to have. One, if you're affected, get the fix out as quick as possible, which should be fine with legal. And then on the other side, if you're not affected by a certain CVE or whatever, VEX will give you the chance to tell your users, okay, my product is not affected, which should be much easier with legal, I guess.
Matt, you have your hand up there.
Yeah, I mean, some things to bear in mind in the bigger picture are that 98% of SBOMs are not public, or 99% are not public. A lot of them are produced in development cycles, staging, whatever. They're not going up there. And VEX is separable. So the consumer of VEX is not just the end user of the SBOM. The consumer of VEX could also be internal sources, internal CI, DevSecOps people, internal people, PCERT teams that could track life cycles and build on the information. The purpose of VEX is to convey a complete picture of a vulnerability at all stages, to show what type of remediations, what tools were used, what analysis was done, what the corrective actions are, all those things. And that information is dynamic as developers and security people look at a vulnerability and fix it in a given product. And that information can be conveyed in VEX. It's the choice of how you make that public, either in the SBOM directly or relative to the SBOM referenced by it. That's your choice. Ideally, though, that's why I go to Apache. Apache, everyone has a project that says, I acknowledge this vulnerability in my product. Here's my remediation, here's some stuff. But VEX formalizes that. It adds structure and information that people will want for different end users.
Cool, makes sense. Any other last minute questions? I'm not caught up on the chat if anyone wants to chime in. You see one about NVD to security audits of random developer source code. I have no idea.
Yeah,
Michael.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that like it sort of depends on the individual project and organization. You're going to see, like, for example, at a lot of large regulated enterprises, they're going to be, if, for example, they're pulling in open source code, they're going to be doing additional layers of scans on open source code in addition to whatever the rest of the folks are doing. They're also going to be doing stuff like, as an example, right, you have your static code analysis, and also just sort of all sorts of other static and dynamic scans, whether it's Black Duck or something else, to sort of determine different potential vulnerabilities regardless. And a lot of it is just because, hey, these things are very complicated, and when you start to, sometimes these vulnerabilities only really pop up when you start to look at like a holistic view of the system of, it's how this piece of software interacts with this one and this one and this one and this one. That combined leads to some sort of vulnerability, and you're always going to see at least larger organizations doing stuff like this.
Matt?
Yeah, I just want to raise awareness. So, I mean, this speaks to, there's a new effort started at OS Foundation. And actually, it's joint cross SPDX. There's something called an SBOM maturity model. They're going to be looking at different industries and different levels of information in the SBOM, and they'll be, the maturity model will reflect the need for vulnerability expression and all this other information that Michael was alluding to. So that people are going to be looking for more and more mature SBOMs with better information over time.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know if you want to drop a note in the meeting notes doc of how folks might be able to learn more about those meetings or where they're taking place.
Yeah, actually, I'm waiting for information myself. I understand there's
Yeah.
place on every other Thursday, but I just was invited to join. So once I have it, I'll pass it along.
Nice, thank you. Meeting overload. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Adolfo, for the presentation and the discussion, everyone. There's no last minute comments. We'll get out a little early. All right. Take care. See you all later. Bye.